Thank you for joining us for this morning's program with Peter Pomerantsev and In Conversation with Dr. Svet Derderyan. I'm Claire Noble, the program manager for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our executive director, Dale Mosier, our board chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium board, welcome. We're in our 49th year of providing our community with thought-provoking and affordable programming. Two notes to be aware of before we get started. To ask questions of today's speakers, please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions in there at any time, and we'll get to as many as time permits. Also, today's program will run until noon. It's being recorded, and you'll be able to find that recording at vailsymposium.org. Just give us a couple of days to get that posted. I'd like to take just a moment to thank some of the organizations and individuals who've helped make tonight's program, or today's program rather, possible. Our sponsors include the Town of Vail, the Vail Daily, the Antlers at Vail, and Vail Resorts Epic Promise. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. Jeannie and Dale Mosier underwrote the entire winter season. The geopolitical series is underwritten by Cindy Ingalls. And today's program is underwritten by Brian Stockmar and Kathy Renman and Jim Picard. The Vail Symposium is supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. Thank you to all of our donors. If you're not a donor but would like to ensure that the Vail Symposium is able to continue offering quality programming, please visit vailsymposium.org to donate. And I hope you'll make plans to join us a week from today on Thursday, February 4th at 6 p.m. for a program on the impending energy transition with Morgan Bazilian. He's the director of the Payne Institute and a professor of public policy at Colorado School of Mines. Previously, he was the lead energy specialist at the World Bank. He'll be in conversation with Alice Jackson, the CEO of XL Energy Colorado, previously with Occidental Petroleum. Now we turn our attention to Russian efforts to amplify disinformation and undermine democracy. Allow me to introduce our distinguished guests. In the interest of time, I will provide condensed bios. Peter Pomerantsev is a senior fellow at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, where he co-directs the ARENA initiative. Between 2017 and 2020, he was a senior fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he was the director of the ARENA Initiative, a research project dedicated to overcoming the challenges of digital era disinformation and polarization. His book on Russian propaganda, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, won the 2016 Royal Society of Literature Ondaatje Prize and was nominated for the Samuel Johnson, Guardian First Book, Pushkin House, and Gordon Burns Prizes. His latest book, This Is Not Propaganda, was released in 2019 and won the Gordon Burns Prize and was a Times Book of the Year. Dr. Svet Derderyan is a professor of instruction in political science at the University of Colorado Boulder and an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Denver. He grew up in Sofia, Bulgaria. His research focuses broadly on global anti-corruption, the role of international organizations in democratization, and foreign direct investment and economic development. Dr. Derderyan obtained his PhD in political science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 2015. He has also worked as a legislative assistant at the United States Senate. He graduated summa cum laude from Hamilton College in New York in 2006 with degrees in economics and international relations. Just a reminder for our audience, please use the Q&A option at the bottom of our screen to submit questions for today's speakers. And again, we'll get to those later in the program. I'm going to turn the program over to Svet and Peter at this time. And if both of you could unmute and turn on your cameras. Great.
Claire, it says that the host has to allow me to turn on my camera.
Okay, let me. There you go. Thank you. And I'll check with you guys both back later in the program.
Lovely. Well, thank you, Claire. Thank you, Chris, for your efforts and for making this happen. Good morning from me. And thank you all patrons of the Vail Symposium for joining us in what I think will be an exhilarating conversation. As Claire mentioned, we'll start the discussion with a few questions prepared by me. This will last for about 35 minutes or so, after which we'll take questions from the audience. Without any delay, let's jump right in. Peter, you started studying and analyzing the role of misinformation in Russian politics long before this notion became a household item in the political discourse in America and much of Europe in the last few years. What motivated you to work on questions of misinformation?
Oh, it wasn't something that I set out to do. After university in Britain, I moved to Russia. I actually went to film school there. And I speak Russian, I'm bilingual. My parents are originally from the former Soviet Union. So, and I lived there for 10 years. And after having gone to film school there, I sort of worked in TV there. This is sort of early Putin years. And I saw this new propaganda system evolve inside of Russia, which I found fascinating because it was so different to the Soviet one. This was a propaganda system that, unlike the Soviet one, didn't try to kind of celebrate some kind of great communist ideal or some higher Marxist truth. Instead, it sort of said, you know, truth is unknowable. All facts are relative. You can't believe anything you see out there. We lie, they lie. All truth is corrupt. There are no values out there, whether left wing or right wing. Everything is just manipulation. And it was a system that didn't really have a clear ideology of left and right. It sort of explained the world through conspiracies. Everything was a conspiracy within a conspiracy. And so conspiracy had replaced ideology. And I could go on. I mean, there were so many interesting things. There was no idea of the future anymore. Everything was based on nostalgias. Sort of all about sort of bringing Russia back up off its knees, but it wasn't clear to be what. And this is a very, very interesting sort of cocktail of messages. And I suppose a very important thing, this was also the beginning of the Russian internet, was the adaptation by the regime, not just of censorship, or much less censorship in order to sort of control the information environment, but to sort of overload it with troll farms, with all sorts of online activity that made truth feel unknowable. And so, you know, my first book, which is called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, was an attempt to sort of describe life inside this new sort of propaganda model. And it ended with me kind of coming back to London to work in London. By that time, I kind of sort of left media to sort of join sort of more academic work. And then my second book was trying to explore whether what I'd seen in Russia was unique to Russia, or whether this is some sort of systemic issue that we see across the world. So my second book, which I shall now shamelessly plug, is a round the world book. I go to South Asia, China, Latin America, Ukraine, and to a certain extent the US, and try to understand whether we're sort of facing some sort of systemic crisis, both in the way we organize our public sphere, whether we can still have a democratic information environment where, you know, debate and deliberation and all these things that make up democracy are still possible, whether there's technological reasons, and whether there are cultural and historical reasons why there might be, to put it gently, some turbulence in how we arrange democracy. Essentially, that's what it really comes down to.
Okay. the next question that I have has to do with the conditions that you think empower the disinformation in various societies around the world. So, what conditions would you say, cultural, economic, demographic, social, make democratic societies particularly vulnerable to misinformation? And where would you place the United States in this?
So, look, there's two factors really, isn't there? There's the technological one, and you use the term there, misinformation. There's a lot of kind of, there's a lot of different uses of these terms. I prefer disinformation. Misinformation usually means sort of accidental rumors and lies that are passed off. Disinformation are kind of campaigns. They're thought through. They have a purpose. But even there, even though we have an old definition of disinformation, in large part based on the Soviet one, sort of Stalin had this term desinformatsiya, to sort of like categorize purposeful, deceptive information campaigns to plant, various lies in let's say in the West or in other regions in the Soviet period. Famously, for example, very simple example, the story that the CIA created AIDS as a weapon was one the KGB created and pushed out in the 70s and 80s. So today, obviously, there's a technological, part. It's very easy to create these campaigns online. Before, you had to plant them in a newspaper, slowly kind of filter them or try to sort of, gently push them through, an information ecosystem with gatekeepers and editors and all those sorts of things. Now, obviously, you don't need that anymore. When the Kremlin or anyone else puts a disinformation campaign online, they just kind of throw it on there. It costs nothing to create. And look, even if nobody believes it can just add to the chaos out there and undermines people's faith in everything. But something very important changes with digital dimension, I think. And I do think we have to zero in on this if we're really trying to grasp the problem. Disinformation campaigns are nothing new, whether from foreign actors, domestic actors. They've been with us since, I don't know, you could say that the Trojan horse was a disinformation operation. They're just a part of statecraft, part of war, part of diplomacy. It's just part of it. There's always been this dark side, nothing new. What's new today is not even the ease with which you can create it, but the way you can scale it. We really have to sort of define what's special about the internet, yeah? It's the way you can scale it, yeah? So not one person or one outlet is pushing something, but thousands or hundreds of thousands of automated accounts who are pretending to be one person. So you're online looking at, some sort of story from somewhere that the CIA created Ebola as a weapon, which is something the Russians have been pushing. You think that it's, this story has been posted on Twitter or Facebook by Bob in Arkansas, but it's not Bob in Arkansas, it's Ivan in St. Petersburg. And Ivan is controlling thousands of accounts in America, in Germany, in many other places. Now that is the systemic difference. So I today would actually say that when we think about disinformation or deception, we're not even talking about deceptive content. We're talking about mass deceptive behavior. That's what's new. I'm a huge supporter of anonymity. I think people have the right to be anonymous online if they want to, for safety, for a million reasons. I'm not talking about anonymity. I think that's a right, actually. I'm talking about mass deceptive campaigns where you don't know whether it's one person, one voice online, or 3 million voices actually controlled by one person. So our public sphere has got completely distorted. So that's, sorry, you were going to say something, Svet, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to jump right in and ask you whether, given what you're saying, you would qualify disinformation as a form of asymmetrical warfare that a state like Russia is using, knowing that it cannot compete reputationally or economically or diplomatically with many of the Western powers, the Western alliance, to the extent that there is still one around the world, and is for this reason choosing a strategy enabled by the digital age that plants a virus of confusion within these societies, and observes somewhat peacefully from the sideline as these societies turn on each other.
So Russia has definitely been a pioneer in using these sort of tools in a state-driven foreign policy. They're actually used by every PR company, well, not every, by a lot of PR companies. If you look, the advertising materials for Cambridge Analytica, the PR company that was, they claim, instrumental in the 2016 election, they say quite openly in their PR documents about their PR activities, we will create fake accounts in order to boost your product or your campaign. So everyone uses these tools. These tools are the tools of social media as currently designed. These are not, this is just what it was kind of created to do to a certain extent, to boost products, through lots of bots. That was the idea. So they're adopting those tools. And you're quite right. I think a big part of it was, and this is repeated in a lot of the literature that Russian kind of military academics have written about in the 90s and 2000s. They're like, how do we get back in the game? We can't really, let's not forget about America. America's far away from Russia. Let's talk about sort of, the American world order around Russia, which Russia really resents. So the fact that small countries around Russia can now be free is something that is very inimical to an empire like Russia, who believes it has a right to dominate the Baltics, parts of Southeastern Europe. So these countries, some of them are now in NATO. Yeah, so invading them, like Russia has done many, many times over its history, is not an option right now. But what if you can go below Article 5? Yeah, what if you can go below military intervention and try what some people call sort of the gray zone activities? It's kind of just below full-on war. And that definitely includes information activities. That includes corruption. That includes economic warfare. When Russian military define information psychological warfare, they don't mean just the internet. They mean a lot of other stuff as well. And you really have to see that whole thing as a complex of issues. But without a doubt, the new technological tools have opened up the opportunities to do a huge amount of mischief with very little cost, as you say. What is the response to a troll farm? What does one do? I don't know. Well, we have no kind of diplomatic theory of proportional response. It's a completely kind of lawless period. And look, America, we can, it's very hard to tease out the influence of Russian operations in America for reasons we can get into. But let's take a Russian neighbor like Estonia. In 2007, Russia essentially took Estonia offline through a bunch of these operations, which are below Article 5, which are in the gray zone. So that included helping to, I don't want to use the word incite, but definitely helping to further inflame riots around ethnic cleavages, around some of the big social divisions inside Estonia, but also most famously through cyber attacks, which took the Estonian parliament, the Estonian media, and the Estonian banking system offline, and information attacks, sort of stirring, using false information, false stories to kind of besmirch Estonia internationally and stoke conflict within the country. So the Russians basically showed you could...
If I may just jump in for a second to put this into context for our audience. Estonia happens to be one of the most advanced digital economies and digital societies in the world. I wonder whether, I assume that to an extent this high level of digitalization over there made them particularly susceptible to what you're talking about.
It did, and at the same time, it's meant that they're actually far ahead now of everybody else, along with Taiwan probably. So the countries on the front line of Russia and China are the ones who are by far and away the most advanced in thinking about and finding solutions to cybersecurity and also social cohesion. So in Taiwan, which is very interesting to look at, for them, they've understood that polarization is a national security issue. And they're thinking very hard and experimenting very, very actively with how can you use social media not to sort of create and further social divisions and animosity within a country, but to build constructive dialogue within a country and build kind of enough, that right balance of pluralism and cohesion that we're going to have to live with if we want to survive in the 21st century. What we have to understand, Russia might be a pioneer in this for exactly the reasons that you stated. They wanted to get back into the game. Now everybody is doing it. China was actually already doing it in Taiwan, in its immediate neighborhood. They're now doing it further and further and braver and braver. Iran is, my God, everybody is. Everybody's getting into the game. This is the new 21st century competition. And it's kind of based around, because we live in a globalized world where everybody's trading with everybody else, everyone's sort of in bed with everybody else, but at the same time, sort of stabbing each other at the same time. The countries that have fallen behind are actually the mature democracies, Britain, America, who just, you know, because we were so on top militarily, just didn't think any of this stuff mattered. I remember meetings at the, with various, and interviewing various State Department people, so in the Obama years, and sort of going, do you realize that Russia and China are conceptualizing this new form of global competition? And the attitude was like, yeah, of course we know, but we just see it as a sign of weakness.
Does Russia have anything else going on for herself in terms of global competition? I mean, you know, I think that you could argue, at least in academic circles, that Russian influence on global affairs is experiencing an ascent in recent years, from its involvement in Syria to the rise of more Russian-friendly populist governments in Europe, to America's questions about possible Russian interference in its domestic affairs. What accounts for Russia's increasing role in global politics? Is it just a troll farm in St. Petersburg that is making this happen?
No, the troll farm in St. Petersburg is, you know, nobody takes it particularly seriously, frankly. I mean, that's just I mean, the fact that it was so easy to discover that particular operation shows you just how much the Russians care about it.
I was speaking metaphorically.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Is it just
okay.
disinformation? That's what I meant.
So listen, it is worth going back to the 1990s for a second, because essentially Russia is doing internationally what Putin's regime developed in the 1990s, because, you know, many of the people in the regime were there in the 1990s and then in the 2000s domestically. What they so I interviewed in my latest book, I interview one of the creators of Yeltsin's campaign in 96 and Putin's campaign in 2000. It's a very interesting guy called Gleb Pavlovsky. And like a lot of these kind of gurus of propaganda, in his own way, very engaging and very, very interesting. 1996, the Russian state is incredibly weak. Inside the country, various regions are taking power. You know, various governors are sort of becoming mini fiefdoms, really. Oligarchs are controlling huge amount of economic and kind of increasingly state activity, sort of buying lawmakers and stuff like that. The Kremlin somehow needs to reassert itself domestically. And Pavlovsky says, what we realized and what nobody else in Russia twigged at that point was that TV held the key, information held the key. If we could make it look like we were big and strong, yeah, that was the key. You know, he was still talking about television. And he's going, oh my God, he says, if we had social media, we would have been completely unstoppable. But we sort of twigged that television was key. And so what they do is start taking control of TV and start creating the sense that the Kremlin is very strong, eventually creating this sort of Putin as a sort of reality show star that's constantly, you know, putting the odd oligarch in jail, just one, just to show that he's in charge, and doing all these symbolic gestures and giving the sense that the Kremlin is everywhere, yeah, even though it actually wasn't when you looked closely at the dynamics. And he said that was the key. We realized that in this new media-powered age, and obviously this is the age when, like, you know, satellite TV is really kind of like getting going, MTV, we realized that perception is everything. Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean that it's all virtual. You still have to put an oligarch in prison. But if Stalin was 75% oppression, 25% information, Putin is 75% information and 25% oppression. You just have to put one oligarch in jail and then do a huge PR campaign to make it feel that the Kremlin is very strong. What they realize internationally is that if they could sort of calibrate the informational effects of their actions, people would be talking about them. People would be scared of them. They would seem bigger and stronger than they were. So that doesn't mean there's not real action. In Syria, Russia, along with Assad, has broken humanitarian norm after humanitarian norm, double tapping hospitals. So you fly over a place, you drop one bomb, usually a hospital or a school, you wait for people to come, you drop another one. This is recorded. So there are real deaths here. But still, even the intervention in Syria, they waited, they saw America wasn't doing anything, they realized there was a gap, and they turned what was obviously a real operation into a huge informational effect. So now they've inserted themselves into Middle Eastern politics that no decisions can be made without them.
Yes.
The very carefully calibrated operation.
Yeah.
The information operations as well, again, there's real effects. I mean, we can talk in detail and try to analyze their impacts on elections in Eastern Europe, their sort of buying up of senior politicians in Italy and in France. That's all recorded. That's real influence. But still, they've realized it's all about perception. And, in that sense, of course, when they did the operation in America, one is always left with the feeling that they were very happy to be caught. It was covert, but it was so easy to spot at all levels, both the social media one and the much more important one that worked through WikiLeaks, the sort of the hacking of the emails. They were covert operations, but you always had the sense that they reveled in being caught, in being talked about, in making themselves look very, very big and scary.
So what I get from your point is that they're being very tactical. They're looking to commit symbolic acts, sometimes symbolic acts like throwing somebody in jail or intervening in a military conflict in one of the less significant countries in the Middle East, or being caught intervening in the world's greatest democracies' elections. And then they magnify the information, they work the information environment to magnify the perception globally that they are a big player that matters and that people are concerned about or afraid of, and should always have a seat at the table, whoever is talking about anything, anywhere from now on.
Very much so. But listen, I think it goes deeper than that. I think they would claim, almost like some postmodernist philosophers, that perception is everything. It's not that they're like, no, this, it's not like this is a cover for having no power. This is real power. Okay. I think they're going a bit more radical than just, oh, let's try to show off how big and strong we are and bluff. It's more than that. I think they're saying this is power.
Okay. Well, that brings me to probably the most obvious, most pertinent question that has to be asked in a conversation like that, which is disinformation seems to be a serious problem. It seems to be a problem in democratic societies. It seems to be a tool of competition in international politics, maybe championed by the Russians, but now everybody's interested in it. What are some of the solutions to disinformation? I assume, Peter, that some of them will be technological, given everything that you have explained to us. But also on a societal level, what can we do here in the US or in other democratic societies to restore the political discourse where sides can debate different opinions on the merit of commonly accepted set of facts and not rely on truths or half-truths or lies to just shut the other side off by saying, this is fake news, or this is just propaganda. I don't even have to listen to what you have to say.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's on the one hand, quite simple. On the other hand, really hard to do. We need a transformation in how we regulate the information environment. We need a transformation in how we design the information environment. And we need a transformation in the role of media. On paper, not that difficult. The sort of regulation we need is really around largely around transparency, and a certain amount of bringing sort of democratic rights into the information environment. So, we talked earlier about how disinformation is really about behavior, but also there's other forms of knowledge that we don't have at the moment. We don't understand why an algorithm shows us one piece of content and not another, how our own data is being used to target us, whether it's by Russia or political campaign or even a benign advertisers. We live kind of in this weird, chaotic darkness, full of information, but with no information about how it works. Of course, that has to be opened up. We need algorithmic accountability for this sort of very complex row around content moderation, whether Twitter was right to take Donald Trump's tweets down. Look, these things cannot be left to companies. They have to be decided in courts of law. We need e-courts that, resolve these disputes like you have in the real world. We need a lot of these kind of basic rights that we've had, that we've developed over centuries of democratic, democratic striving. We need to bring them into the online world. That won't solve everything, but it will make, I would make the kind of mass deceptive activity, that kind of like creating 1,000 bots to push a certain sort of like hashtag or opinion. I would make that sort of a behavior illegal. I do think the internet has to come back to one person, one voice.
Yeah. Can countries do that? Or do we need some
we're going towards that very fast.
International coordination or international?
No. Only two places matter: the US and EU. The EU is already moving towards that in terms of regulatory sort of norm setting. So the EU is already moving towards this. In December, it published its Democracy Action Plan, already talking about algorithms have to be open. We have to have human rights online. I think we haven't got so far as to talk about one person, one voice online, but I do think we need to start that conversation. How do you do that in a way that is secure, where it can't be governments giving out these online identities? That would be awful. How do we create that in a way around various types of civic technology? But we've got to look, if we want a public sphere, it does depend on one person, one voice. It can't be this weird, distorted hall of mirrors that we have now. If we want human rights online, if we want law online, then you have to have e-courts that make these decisions. So the EU is moving towards that. There's very good bills in Congress, in the Senate around algorithmic accountability and fairness. They're there. It's just whether America has enough, cohesion to pass laws which are completely bipartisan. They affect both sides the same way. There's nothing it doesn't advantage any side. It's just about having a transparent and rules-based, information environment. That won't solve everything. People will still want to listen to lies because we want, all the propaganda theory that we know from decades and decades of looking at it. People want propaganda. They're desperate for it. People are petrified by the complexity of chaos of the world, and they will look for identity lies to fill in the void. So all we can do is make a more rights-based, transparent, and more democratic online environment. That's the first step. The second step is designing new types of social spaces. Go back to de Tocqueville. Remember de Tocqueville describing America as full of these kind of like township institutions, people working on democracy, people from different sides organizing around everything from, local youth clubs through to, how to the municipal budget. How can the online environment do that? Online environment can't be Facebook and Twitter, which are two companies sort of designed not in the public interest in mind. It should be full, like Tocqueville's America, of lots and lots of different kinds of platforms, all, working together, where people come together across divides to fix the local tennis court or fix the local roads, or maybe more kinds of democratic participation, coming together to create the municipal budget. So we need lots of this activity, that, you know, like just as in de Tocqueville's description of America,
Peter,
brings people together online.
Isn't the online space even more conducive to people separating themselves into different groups and selecting who your friends will be and who your non-friends will be?
That's just the way.
Living happily in your echo chamber where your confirmatory bias, which you say we know from psychology, is something very important for people, and people long for opportunities for their confirmatory bias to be satisfied. How are we going to solve this in the online space?
So firstly, no, you're talking about something very specific. Without a doubt, sort of the social media that are popular now have tapped into deep needs around sort of a mob mentality and crowd identity. It wasn't that way before 2008. You know, we had a different internet, not based on Facebook and Twitter, that was full of live journals and blogs where there was increased public participation. When the Creative Commons was created, out of which Wikipedia came. Wikipedia is sort of a glance of the internet that could have been. Look, there'll always be a place for this kind of, you know, social media that's based on kind of a very sort of crass commercial logic. Yeah, think of it as a city. You know, a city will have malls. Facebook is like a mall. You know, it's basically they're trying to sell you stuff. It's not based on friendship. It's based on, so, you know, it's a system that's based on you delivering your attention and data so they can sell you stuff. That's a mall, essentially. A city can have a mall. That's absolutely fine. And, you know, when we go shopping, that's a lot of human needs about who we are and identity and all the, you know, we buy certain shoes to mark ourselves the way we like something on Facebook to go, oh, look, I'm in this gang. That's fine. That's part of the ecosystem, but it can't just be that. We also need parks and town halls and libraries and all these other things. So that has to be supported. You know, that has to be, you know, that has to be developed and encouraged. So those are kind of spaces. And the last thing I was going to say, we certainly need a new type of media. So far, kind of the media theory of change has always been based around the idea that pluralism will lead to better debate. What we're seeing now is that pluralism, under certain conditions, and this started with cable news, can tip into polarization and hyper-partisanship where people can't talk to each other anymore. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a space for that. I'm not sort of like, you know, but I do think we need a new generation of media who get up in the morning thinking, okay, how do we start engaging different audiences? Okay, we need a CNN producer to get up in the morning and go, how do I create programs that also engage Fox News viewers? Now, in Europe, we have a tradition of that. That's always been a mission of public service broadcasting. In America, I think there'll be some sort of civic media, probably bottom up. But we need a lot of these kind of experiments.
Well,
the sociology, by the way.
I agree with you about the need, but how do we proceed to materialize this? You know, or to actually get something going? You know, considering the profit motive in media, that media exists due to you know, or media is successful due to private interest or viewers' interest. How would you convince a media, you know, even if it is a grassroots type of media organization or a local media organization, that they should forego their any bottom line considerations and possibly risk bankruptcy or lack of success in the name of some sort of civic duty that in the global discourse is still open about who should be or who should be actually in charge of deciding these things, right?
So it's a very good question. So in Europe, at least, we do have a tradition of public service broadcasting, which is not state, it's independent from the state, but it has a public service remit. You know, that's its mission, to sort of be something for everyone and to help foster a public discourse. So there is a tradition of that. I don't know if America is kind of ready for that, or if that's possible in America. So I expect in America it will be many civic institutions. I assume then that that they will be supported by you know, the way civic organizations are in America. Probably they'll, you know, there's a way of giving them a sort of tax-free breaks, and there'll be charities or NGOs. So that sort of, I mean, I just think that goes with the grain of American tradition. Ethan Suckerman, who's one of the people who thinks about this most in America, he's a professor at Amherst. He actually does think it's time for America to think about a BBC-style approach, not one mega corporation, but he proposes a tax on the companies, the social media companies that work on, what's known today as surveillance capitalism, who basically exploit people's data in order to then target them with commercial or political propaganda, not to stop their activity, but to put a tax on their activity that then goes towards this kind of civic media, which would have kind of very strict rules around, how it can, what it can do to remain a civic media. In Australia, there's laws being passed that would tax the social media companies and then repurpose that towards journalism. The EU is also proposing things. There's many solutions out there. I think that the point is to sort of, I just don't know to what extent in America you could ever really have, where there is no strong tradition of public service broadcasting. I don't know to what extent you can really bring that in America. I think all the great things that have happened in America have been through this much more sort of Tocquevillian process. And you have this incredible civil society, incredible tradition of generous giving. I mean, in Europe, that just sounds crazy, that rich people kind of like make life happen through their donations. In America, it's part of the culture and part of life. So I think every country will have its own thing. I think much more important than that is actually defining what we mean. What is the purpose of this sort of media? How is its success rated? What are the kind of, how do we measure the good in this sense? That's really the challenge, because we can't define it. We struggle to define anything together at the moment. So I think that's much more of a struggle rather than finding ways of funding it. When people understand it's a good idea, America always finds ways of funding things.
Right. Good. Well, it's 11:42. Claire, I don't know whether you think it would be a good idea at this point to gather some questions from the audience.
Sure, thank you. That was a really great conversation between the two of you, and it has generated a lot of questions, and so I can just start asking some of those. One of the first questions comes from Michael Porter, and what he's asking is whether or not the previous administration fully investigated Russian interference in the 2016 election. And I just wanted to circle back to something, Peter, you had said earlier about Russia engaging in these activities at a very low cost. And it seems to me that's both a low economic cost, but also there wasn't really much pushback unless we're missing something. And maybe you can point to examples where some countries have sort of fought back against Russian disinformation.
So look, everybody knows what did and didn't happen with the previous administration regarding Russia. There was, however, very good hearings in the Senate and Congress. There was excellent reports written in both Senate and Congress. So there was the Mueller investigation. There is a wealth of really hard research that people can look at and make up their own minds. However, you're quite right. What is the response? What do you do? This is like, what are you going to do? Sort of let off a stink bomb in St. Petersburg? I mean, what is the response? I suggest two ways forward. One is I think the response has to be asymmetric. There are no costs to Russia or to China in the information environment. They don't care. They don't care if they're caught out lying. They're like, yeah, so what? I'm lying. What are you going to do about it? They have no reputational costs because Russia first, and now, maybe slightly to my surprise, China are just like, we don't care what you think anymore. We're going to be rude and in your face, and their wolf diplomats online just shower abuse and disinformation at will. So there's no reputational cost either. You can't go, ha ha, we caught you doing something sneaky. They're like, yeah, come on, what are you going to do? So you have to find out what they care about. So one interesting example, Germany. So during the previous German federal elections, there was a hack of the German Bundestag, much like the hack of the Democratic National Committee here in the US. A bunch of websites appeared called, I think, Bundestag Hack, sort of clearly preparing the way for a lot of hack material to come down. And then we don't know what happened exactly, but we do know, or we have heard through the rumor mill and off-record conversations, that there were some hard conversations between German political elites and Russian political elites. And I don't know what the Germans said, but they must have said something indicating that the costs of this would not be nice for Russia. I don't know what it was. They could have said something about, we won't help support the construction of a new gas pipeline through Europe, or Mercedes won't build a new factory in Russia. I don't know what they said. But it's finding out what these countries care about and saying, okay, if you do this, we won't do this. The other thing I'd really like to see, apart from the sort of developing these asymmetric diplomatic responses, is a kind of information alliance, which I think has to include countries like Taiwan and Ukraine, where a kind of an aggressive malign information operation against one would be seen as an aggressive information operation against all. So next time, Russia takes out the Estonian banking system, or Russia takes out, the Ukrainian electronic grid, which they've done, that's not just seen as a Ukrainian and Estonian problem, that's a problem for everyone. And the reply will come from Germany, because Estonia and Ukraine can't do anything to Russia, but Germany can. So that's what I think would be the ways forward, these kind of alliances and these asymmetric responses.
So the next question comes from Fred, and this is a little different, but I think it's related, and I really think it's directed to both of you, and that is the current protests in Russia regarding Navalny being imprisoned after he returned from being poisoned. Could you comment on that situation, either from what do you think Navalny's endgame is, or what do you think is going to happen with these protests and how Putin is going to respond? Svet, why don't we start with you?
Well, I have to start humbly and say that I think it's too early to make an assessment about what the outcome of this protest might be. Unfortunately, maybe on the pessimistic side of things, we have a history of large protests in Russia over the last few years, fueled by Navalny as well, and other opposition leaders and opposition movements, and they have not been able to accomplish much. Putin's fortress is as strong as it has always been. Now, is the scandal of the fact that this opposition leader was poisoned and barely survived and is now back and is imprisoned, is it a strong enough emotional fuel for this protest to last long enough and to be large enough to create some sort of democratizing spirit within this society that resonates with the government? As I said, I unfortunately have to say that it's too early to tell. That said, let's not forget that the end of a much greater empire, the Soviet Empire, came as a result in the late 80s, exactly from mass protest movements taking place in many countries at the same time. The power of the popular dissatisfaction in these moments was something that even the Soviet superstate could not handle. Now Russia is not the Soviet superstate, but also the level of these protests is not the same level that we observed in the late 80s. So I don't know, on that kind of underwhelming note, I give it back to Peter.
Yeah. What Svet said is completely accurate. I mean, there's three factors here which I think we can try to think through. The first one is, let's say, the propaganda model. Russia's propaganda model is built around the messaging model, around a very simple one-line formula. There is no alternative to Putin. So even when Russia still does actually have kind of like political debates on TV, all the parties are under control of the Kremlin. Everyone knows that. So you have this weird sense that even pluralism is manipulated. Therefore, there's very little you can do about it. But also, all the leaders of these parties are not very impressive people, and that's on purpose. You're meant to look at them and go, well, Putin is much better than the crazy commie or the crazy fascist. Look at him. He's above them, this regal figure. So Navalny is saying there is an alternative. And whether that has some long-term effects in people's worldviews, maybe, I don't know. It's a very, very long game. There's also something very Russian going on here, which I don't think can be reduced to these kind of like Western political calculations. Whether it's Solzhenitsyn, whether it's Sakharov, whether it's people in the 19th century struggling against the Tsars. There's this old, really sort of almost Greek tragedy story of people trying to change something in Russia, never being really able to because the forces against them are so much bigger. But just with their sheer bravery, their refusal to bend, they kind of, kindle some sort of ideal of bravery. I mean, you've got to understand that the Russian system is based around breaking people, and it always has been, really. There's a whole vocabulary inside Russian discourse about the extent to which you were broken but not quite or compromised with the state. It's a whole, there's a whole, like, people live with these kind of like compromises and humiliations all the time and every day. And Navalny's kind of saying, I have no fear, in a culture based on fear, which makes some people inspired and others hate him because it's very unpleasant if you've been broken when somebody else hasn't been. So that's a very old, that's almost a war that's happening in some metaphysical realm, which has been going on for centuries in Russia. And it's hard to explain to Westerners, but it's just so vital if you're Russian. And where the count is not by kind of days or hours or even years, it's by some sort of, spiritual almost measurement. But getting away from the spiritual sphere to the real sphere, look, whenever I ask Navalny's people, like, what should the West be doing? They're like, we don't need any of your proclamations about human rights. That doesn't help us. Navalny's argument is that the West is implicit in the Putin regime by normalizing its corruption, by being the place where corrupt, kleptocratic Russian institutions and companies keep their money, legitimize their money. So his response has always been, stop doing that, get rid of this corrupt laundromat, and start putting sanctions and start taking away the property. Actually, he's pretty hard in his conclusions of corrupt Russian officials and their oligarchical proxies. So his team have come up with a series of measures that they think should be the response, including the kind of, the arrest of the property of some of the richest people in Great Britain, who are many of whom are Russian oligarchs. So, they're pretty clear about what they want changed. I have to say it's encouraging to see kleptocracy put right at the top of the new administration's agenda. They now say that we see corruption and kleptocracy as a global security threat. We're going to start taking measures against it. We'll see whether those measures get the little people in the system or actually hurt the system. Because it's very easy to say you're going to fight kleptocracy. It has a way of, giving you some small fry to put in prison, but the system remains.
Sandy has a question that I think we've talked around, but he's asking it very specifically, is what is the motivation behind the disinformation campaign by Russia against the United States, and what is their goal? And to that, I would just add, we tend to focus a lot on the political, but I understand that Russia is actually amplifying a lot of the anti-vaxxer type information in the United States as well. And I don't know if you're familiar with that or aware of that.
Well, look, I think the ultimate goal is what Svet and I talked about this, like, using information as a way to get back into the game and thinking about information effects as a way to elevate your own position. That I think is the ultimate goal for Russia, for Putin. Again, it's really an extension of the domestic propaganda. There is no alternative to me. I'm big and strong. I'm big and strong at home, and look at me on the global stage as well. Yeah. And Russia feels that it has a right to be at the high table of global politics. That's just what they are. They're a great empire, and how dare you not let us in? So that's kind of the goal in the meta sense. But yes, you're quite right in terms of the tools used. Look, there's a bit of, actually everybody has this as part of their warfare, but it's quite explicitly kind of stated in a lot of Russian theory. In order you know, in order to keep the adversary away from you here, keep them occupied at home. Stir as much trouble as you can for them at home. So, any kind of trust, lack of trust, confusion, polarization, hyperpartisanship, anything like that is just, that's always been used. That was used by the Soviets. They would stake racial tensions in the Cold War. And it's used now. And when it comes to stuff like medical things, subverting trust in medical authorities, I mean, that's an old and honorable, or I'd say an old and dishonorable tradition of Soviet disinformation, which is now being done online. And China's doing it too. Iran is doing it too. Everyone's at it.
Well, I also got a copy of your book. And one of the things I really enjoyed about your book is that, yes, it was about disinformation, but it was also people's stories. And so you talked about some in particularly anguishing stories, like the story of Maria Ressa. So could you give just a little bit of background on that story and give us an idea of what's going on with Maria now? Because I tried to find whether or not she was in jail or awaiting sentencing or where she's at in that process.
Mm-hmm. So Maria Ressa is a really sort of incredible journalist in the Philippines. She's actually American Filipino, and she created a wonderful online outlet called Rappler, which was full of the idealism of the early internet. It was all about. She was inspired by the book The Wisdom of Crowds. She was like, okay, let's create a news media, which is also a social media. So people come, they give us stories, they help each other during cataclysms. There are a lot of hurricanes in the Philippines. So let's blend news and social media to create this kind of community of the good. And she created that, and then very soon bad political actors realized that actually social media could be used for something completely different. And she came under huge attack, her and her organization, from the new president and his proxies in the Philippines, when they dared criticize him, when they dared started writing stories about his really kind of scourge of extrajudicial killings, which the government had initiated, sort of bodies piling up in the streets of Manila, kind of a huge humanitarian catastrophe. When they started writing about that, suddenly this kind of like locust infestation of trolls and bots descended upon them and started saying, "You're fake news," personal insults, sexual insults. And, and they started wearing away at people's trust in them, people's belief in them. They destroyed this kind of community they created. A lot of these were actually, again, weren't real accounts. These weren't real people. These were troll farms created by the government to give the sense there were hundreds of thousands of people who thought it. Once a bit of research had been done, they could tell that actually there were few real people. A lot of it was amplified and coordinated and deceptive. But it doesn't matter. Their reputation was destroyed. And once their reputation was destroyed, once they were alienated, then the government opened these kind of like non-stop court cases, which you see in a lot of hybrid regimes and dictatorships, a tax thing. A lot of them trumped up. They don't go anywhere. They get thrown out of court. But because the courts are still more or less free in the Philippines, but they take up so much time, so much money, constantly threatening you with imprisonment. They bog you down in this stuff. And no, she's still free, but on bail all the time. The advertisers leave. You're too toxic to touch. So this is how you kind of destroy a media in a country which is a democracy. I mean, the Philippines is a democracy. And of course, when Maria and others complain about these social media attacks, the response is from the sort of spokespeople and proxies of the government, this is just freedom of expression. You guys wanted freedom of expression, you Democrats. Well, here it is. Lots and lots of freedom of expression. And we have to, ask ourselves very, very strongly, I mean, is the creation of mass armies of trolls, is that part of freedom of expression or not?
This has been a fascinating discussion, but unfortunately we're out of time. But I did tell you guys I would give you both the last word. I'm going to put some qualifications on that last word. And that is, I would just like you to express your optimism or pessimism that we're going to get a handle on this disinformation and at least be able to contain it in the future. Svet, we'll start with you, and Peter, then we'll leave you with the last word.
My general attitude towards this very serious problem right now is that it will require a lot of coordination on the national and also on the international level, and it will probably take a while to get all the bits and pieces in the right places to be able to control the information environment in a way that is inclusive and representative and proper and accountable for everybody. I think that this problem is going to remain a fashionable one for decades to come. And what we probably should do, at least from a psychological perspective, is get used to the fact that it is with us, try to become cognizant of its effects, and try to tread carefully, however we want to approach the ever unstable information environment out there.
Thank you, Peter.
Look, there's two problems here. One is a Russia problem, and Russia will continue to be a problem even if we have the most ideal information environments. It was one before. It's an aggressive revisionist state, and we need a coherent Russia policy, which we haven't had for a very long time. That's doable, you know. The one about disinformation, look, let's look to history. When radio first appeared, people were euphoric about it. It was going to bring people together and stop all wars. Very quickly, Stalin and Hitler realized that, you know, wow, what a propaganda tool, and use it. And it takes a while for democracies, including, for example, in Britain with the creation of the BBC, to go, oh, wow, how can you use radio for civic education and for good things? It takes a while for democracies to respond. But it's happened before. We've done it before. The question is, how bad do things get before, you know, the better angels of democracy start going, oh, you know, how do we actually use these tools for some sort of public good? So I'm just hoping that the crisis that we get to isn't as awful as the ones that we had in the 20th century before we kind of decide to do something useful and beneficial with these tools.
I hope you're right. Peter, Svet, thank you so much for your time and your expertise today. To our online audience, thank you for joining us, and I hope we'll see you here next Thursday for our program on navigating the energy transition. Everybody have a great day, and thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.